heat of the Cold War, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a high-stakes chess match. Ideologies clashing across continents. Trade was tightly controlled, borders even tighter. Western brands practically banned in the USSR. But one American soda company managed to do the unthinkable. In the late 1980s, PepsiCo briefly became the sixth largest military power on Earth. Yes, Pepsi. So how did a soda company infiltrate the Soviet Union? And how exactly did Pepsi end up with a fleet of warships? Let's try and find out.
Hello, I'm Mike Droberg, a Marine Corps veteran and filmmaker, and we will try to answer these questions on today's episode of Forgotten History.
(1972). The Cold War is at a boiling point. The United States and the Soviet Union have stockpiled over 40,000 nuclear warheads, enough to end life on Earth many times over. Tensions are high, and the world is desperate for a pause in the madness. Enter President Richard Nixon. That year, he becomes the first American president to visit Moscow, signaling a major shift in Cold War diplomacy. This wasn't just a photo op. Nixon's mission was part of a new strategy, détente, an effort to reduce tensions between the East and the West. And out of this trip came one of the most important arms control agreements of the 20th century, SALT I. SALT stood for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, a series of negotiations between the US and the USSR to cap the number of nuclear weapons and delivery systems. The result? An interim agreement that froze the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles each side could have. But SALT I didn't stop there. It also included the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or ABM. At first glance, ABM seemed like a good idea. Missile shields to intercept incoming nukes. But the logic of the Cold War was twisted. If one side believed it could block a retaliatory strike, it might be more willing to launch a first strike. So both nations agreed to limit themselves to just 2 ABM sites each, later reduced to 1. The goal was to preserve mutually assured destruction, a terrifying balance, but one that kept fingers off the buttons. And while world leaders were negotiating warheads, one corporate executive was busy negotiating soda deals. Donald M. Kendall, CEO of PepsiCo, was part of Nixon's entourage. His mission? Get Pepsi into the Soviet Union, and that he did. Donald M. Kendall wasn't just a businessman. He was well connected politically and had long understood the power of blending business with diplomacy. In fact, he was friends with Richard Nixon, even before Nixon became president. Kendall had supported Nixon's political career and had lobbied heavily for Pepsi's global expansion throughout the 1960s. In 1971, just before Nixon's landmark trip to China, Kendall helped arrange for Pepsi to be served at a diplomatic reception in Washington with Chinese officials. A small move, but one that symbolized American business interests working hand-to-hand with diplomacy. So when Nixon announced his trip to Moscow in 1972, Kendall worked his connections and got himself added to the U.S. trade delegation. The trip wasn't just about arms control, it was also about opening economic doors. Kendall saw it as his chance to put Pepsi on the map, in the world's largest untapped market. That day, Pepsi became the first American consumer product legally sold behind the Iron Curtain. But there was a catch. The Soviets couldn't use US dollars. So they went with the next best thing, vodka. Pepsi shipped soda concentrate to the USSR. The USSR then paid in Stolichnaya vodka. A Cold War barter system was born, and for the first time, capitalist cola was flowing freely behind the Iron Curtain. With vodka flowing west and cola flowing east, Pepsi had cracked the Iron Curtain. But this wasn't just about drinks, it was about influence. Pepsi didn't just sell the soda, they built bottling plants across the Soviet Union, in places like Ukraine, Uzbekistan, and Russia itself. For many Soviet citizens, Pepsi became a symbol of modernity, a fizzy taste of Western luxury in a drab communist world. It was refreshing, sweet, and forbidden, until now. Inside the USSR, drinking Pepsi meant you had connections, access, and a hint of American cool. But while the brand was booming behind the Iron Curtain, a big problem was brewing. The original vodka for soda barter worked when Pepsi's footprint was small. But as the factories expanded and demand exploded, vodka alone couldn't cover the cost. And even with all those factories, the USSR still had to rely on PepsiCo for the most important part, the syrup concentrate. Why? Because the Pepsi formula was a closely guarded trade secret, produced only in the US. The Soviets could bottle it, they could distribute it, but they couldn't replicate the real thing without that liquid gold. So, as the thirst for Pepsi grew, so did the Soviet Union's debt. They needed a new form of payment, something big enough to keep the cola flowing. And in true Cold War fashion, they turned to their military. Fast forward to the 1980s. The Cold War is cooling, but the Soviet economy is burning down. Years of centralized planning, bloated military budgets, and collapsing oil prices have drained the Kremlin dry. Even Gorbachev's reforms, perestroika and glasnost, can't stop the spiral. But one thing hasn't changed. The USSR still owes Pepsi. The original vodka for concentrate deal from the 1970s got Pepsi in the door, but now the brand has exploded across the Soviet states. And vodka isn't enough to cover the cost. That's when someone proposed something wild. What if we give Pepsi some of our military hardware? In 1989, PepsiCo struck a deal with the Soviet government. In exchange for more Pepsi syrup, the USSR handed over 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. That's an entire Cold War fleet, valued at $3 billion. And so, just like that, Pepsi became the 6th largest navy in the world, on paper. But Pepsi had no interest in sailing the 7 seas. They weren't a defense contractor, they were a soda company. They didn't own dry docks, they didn't have clearance, and they definitely weren't about to park a Soviet sub outside corporate headquarters. So they did what made sense. They sold the entire fleet to a Swedish scrap company, fast, clean, and under the radar. The ships were delivered demilitarized, stripped, and towed straight to Sweden. Pepsi never fired a shot, but they still made a profit. One Pepsi executive famously quipped, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are." It was surreal, it was strategic, and it was one of the strangest flexes in Cold War history. However, unfortunately, Pepsi's dominance didn't last long. By 1991, the Soviet Union was gone, dissolved into 15 separate republics, and with it, the Pepsi barter deal collapsed. In post-Soviet chaos, Coca-Cola swept in. With new markets opening and capitalism surging, Coke quickly overtook Pepsi and dominated the region. But how? How did Pepsi go from owning warships to losing the Cola War in Russia? Well, it came down to timing and strategy. Pepsi had built its Soviet empire on a barter system, vodka for concentrate, managed by a central government. But when the USSR fell, that entire system fell with it. Pepsi's bottling plants were trapped behind new borders tied to broken agreements. And the Kremlin they once dealt with, gone. Meanwhile, Coca-Cola came in fast and hard. They brought cash, marketing, and a modern supply chain. No barters, no waiting on government approval. In just a few years, Coke had 5 times as many bottling plants across the former USSR. And Pepsi, they were stuck trying to salvage a system that no longer existed. So, for one surreal moment, Pepsi was a superpower. They infiltrated the Iron Curtain, disarmed the Cold War fleet, and made history. But they lost the long game. Still, the legacy remains as one of the strangest, most unexpected stories of corporate power in the Cold War. So yes, a soda company once owned a fleet of Soviet warships. Not as a joke, not as a movie plot. It really happened. Pepsi went toe-to-toe with the Soviet system, built factories behind the Iron Curtain, and bartered for vodka and battleships, only to lose the Cold War to their biggest rival when capitalism finally opened the gates. So what do you think? Was Pepsi a Cold War genius, or did they blow the biggest lead in soda history? Let us know in the comments below.
Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any comments or show ideas, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks again.